Imagine this: a former prince, a former president, and a fire-breathing political commentator all tangled up in one of the biggest controversies to hit the UK in years. And no, this isn't some satirical punchline. This is the reality. Prince Harry, now living in California, finds himself at the center of a global culture war, one that's not just about royal drama or celebrity gossip. This is about something much bigger: free speech. Now, add into the mix voices like Donald Trump and Ben Shapiro, both of whom are calling for an absolutely wild solution: Harry's deportation. And before you laugh it off as just another round of political theater, take a moment to think about how we even got here. The UK, once known for its sharp wit, biting satire, and strong opinions, has become the battleground for a fight no one expected. Arrests aren't being made for violent crimes or corruption. They're happening because people are speaking their minds online. Tweets, opinions, jokes, things that should be protected under the banner of free speech are landing people in hot water. People are getting arrested just for questioning gender ideologies or challenging the mainstream narrative. How did it come to this? Well, let's dive into the mess that has the UK and now the world on edge. In the UK, something strange is unfolding. What started as whispers about the erosion of free speech has now turned into a full-blown crisis. It's not the typical kind of censorship we've seen in authoritarian regimes, though. This is different. Here, ordinary people, journalists, comedians, even regular citizens are being dragged into courtrooms and arrested, not for committing violent crimes or anything resembling public threats, but for their words, specifically their words online. It all started with tweets, opinions that challenged the current progressive orthodoxy of the moment. If you speak out against gender ideologies or question government narratives, you might just find yourself face to face with law enforcement. And it's not just the regular cops either. Armed officers are showing up at people's doors, hauling them off in front of their families for simply voicing dissent. This isn't an isolated incident either. Graham Lahan, a comedian, became one of the more public victims of this chilling reality. Once known for making millions laugh with his sitcoms, Lahan's life took a turn when he found himself handcuffed and arrested for making jokes deemed offensive by some. The UK, once a beacon of free speech, has now become a place where comedy and truth can get you locked up. And the most troubling part, the public doesn't seem to realize how deep the issue goes. Mainstream media outlets barely cover these arrests, and when they do, it's usually buried beneath the noise of celebrity gossip and political dramas. For many, the belief that free speech is still alive in the UK is nothing more than a convenient illusion. The reality: people are beginning to fear for their right to speak freely without facing consequences. As the free speech crisis in the UK escalated, Donald Trump, ever the provocateur, couldn't stay silent. During a meeting with Nigel Farage in the Oval Office, Trump made his feelings clear. What's happening in Britain is downright bizarre and deeply disturbing. He called it out as a dangerous trend that should alarm anyone who values free expression. Coming from a man who built his entire political brand on battling political correctness and defending the right to speak freely, these weren't just idle words. They were a warning shot. Trump, with his knack for cutting straight to the heart of a controversy, didn't just voice concern. He made it clear that the rise of censorship in the UK wasn't a trend to be ignored. The UK's attempt to silence dissent was something Trump saw as a threat to not just British values, but global ideals of free speech. And while many of Trump's followers in the US were already used to his blunt takes on just about everything, his comments about the UK sparked something bigger: a growing unease among Americans about where all this censorship might be headed. Trump wasn't just commenting on the UK's issues, he was sounding the alarm for the rest of the world. What happens when freedom of speech begins to crumble in a country like the UK? Could it happen elsewhere? The question began to echo louder, and people started to pay attention, not just to the UK struggle, but to the potential global impact. The fire really started to blaze when Ben Shapiro, a well-known political commentator, joined the conversation. With his trademark blend of sarcasm and sharp critique, Shapiro didn't just comment on the UK's free speech issues, he took it to the next level. On Fox News, he mockingly called for Prince Harry's deportation, sparking both laughter and outrage. But there was more to his words than just a punchline. Why Harry? Why would Shapiro, a staunch defender of free speech, focus his ire on a former royal living in California? The answer lies in the irony of the situation. Prince Harry, a non-citizen of the UK, is free to come and go as he pleases, while regular citizens are being arrested for expressing opinions online. Critics like Shapiro and many others see Harry as a symbol of progressive elitism, a figurehead who, despite benefiting from the very freedoms he's now pushing to restrict, is promoting the same culture of censorship that's choking the free speech of ordinary Britons. It's not just that Harry's become a target for right-wing commentators, it's what he represents. His ties to the progressive elite make him the perfect scapegoat. While he enjoys the privileges of freedom in California, many Brits feel like they're losing theirs back home. And in the eyes of figures like Shapiro, Harry's involvement in pushing these ideas only serves to fuel the fire of censorship that's threatening to consume not just the UK, but the world. So, when Shapiro suggested that Harry be deported, it wasn't just a joke, it was a stark critique of the larger forces at play. Harry, once a symbol of tradition and royalty, had become a lightning rod for a much deeper, more troubling trend. As the crisis of free speech deepened in the UK, a curious thing began to happen. While British voices were being silenced, whether by arrest, censorship, or media indifference, American voices started to rise in protest. Among them, a number of independent journalists and commentators began calling attention to the erosion of free speech in Britain, turning what was once a domestic issue into a global conversation. Take Elon Musk's platform, formerly Twitter, for example. It's become an unlikely battleground for the fight for free speech, especially as journalists like Hannah Kirkpatrick began to go viral with videos highlighting the creeping authoritarianism in the UK. Hannah, a former Sky News journalist turned outspoken commentator, quickly gained a massive following by simply pointing out the censorship and biased policing plaguing Britain. Her videos, often laced with humor and sharp sarcasm, cut through the noise of mainstream media and offered a glimpse into the harsh realities faced by those speaking out against the status quo. But it wasn't just the online world that started to take notice. In fact, Americans began to reach out to these UK voices in increasing numbers, worried that the same thing could happen in their own country. Hannah's inbox was filled with messages from concerned followers urging her to be cautious, with some even suggesting she apply for political asylum in the US. The fear was palpable. People were genuinely worried that speaking the truth would result in severe consequences. The reality was starting to set in. The UK was no longer the land of sharp wit and fearless debate. It was quickly becoming a place where speaking out against the mainstream narrative came with serious, life-altering risks. And as British voices were being silenced, American platforms and personalities were stepping in to amplify them, turning what was once a regional issue into an international conversation about the future of free speech in the West. While the voices of independent commentators grew louder, the mainstream media in the UK seemed determined to stay silent, even as the censorship crisis escalated. Take Graham Lahan, for instance. The comedian, once celebrated for his sharp, satirical humor, became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the UK's free speech crackdown. After his arrest for a joke deemed offensive by some, you'd think the story would have made headlines. But it didn't. ITV, one of the UK's largest networks, completely ignored it. Why? Because the narrative didn't fit. The mainstream media, more concerned with protecting the political status quo, chose not to report on this growing problem. Graham's arrest, an event that should have sparked nationwide outrage, was buried, and the UK public was left to believe that everything was fine. But for those paying attention, this media silence spoke volumes. It wasn't just a failure to report, it was a deliberate erasure of the truth. But where the mainstream failed, independent voices stepped in. YouTubers, podcasters, and citizen journalists began to rise, filling the void left by the traditional press. These voices, often ignored or mocked by the establishment, were now taking center stage. Figures like Hannah Kirkpatrick, who had left traditional journalism to speak out, gained massive followings, especially in the US, where the situation in Britain started to be seen as a warning sign. This shift in media dynamics highlighted a crucial point. As the mainstream media continued to ignore the issues, alternative platforms like YouTube and Twitter became the new front line for free speech. The voices speaking out against censorship were now reaching global audiences, drawing in not just UK citizens, but also Americans who were starting to ask themselves, could this happen here? It was a stark reminder that when the establishment silences certain truths, new platforms rise to amplify them, and the world was starting to listen. Amid the growing media silence and public outcry, Nigel Farage, never one to shy away from controversy, stepped into the spotlight. His appearance before a U.S. congressional hearing became a pivotal moment in this unfolding drama. Farage didn't mince words as he laid out the disturbing truth about how free speech was rapidly eroding in the UK. He explained how ordinary Britons, just a few years ago, could freely express opinions that have now become grounds for criminal charges. Farage's words struck a nerve, not just in the US, but back home in Britain, where many were beginning to feel like their government was actively working against them. His message was simple, unapologetic, and direct. The UK government had turned its back on its citizens, prioritizing the protection of a politically correct agenda over the preservation of free speech. This wasn't just about isolated incidents anymore. It was a systemic problem, one that was now spiraling out of control. But Farage's appearance didn't just mark a moment of clarity, it also exposed the deepening divide between the UK government and the people. As the government continued to deny any real issue, Farage gave a voice to those who felt silenced by the establishment. He was speaking not just for himself, but for the growing number of Brits who felt ignored, disrespected, and outright punished for expressing dissenting opinions. It was a wake-up call. For many Americans watching, Farage's testimony offered a sobering reminder of how quickly free speech can be silenced under the guise of political correctness. His blunt truth wasn't just about defending free speech in the UK. It was a warning to the world about the dangers of complacency when it comes to protecting fundamental rights. Farage's role in amplifying this issue proved that, even when mainstream media is silent, there are still voices willing to fight for the truth. The consequences of this growing suppression of free speech in the UK are becoming increasingly hard to ignore. What began as subtle, isolated incidents has now ballooned into a full-fledged crisis. The arrests, the media silence, the public backlash, these are all symptoms of a much deeper issue. And it's not just about what's happening in the courtroom or the media, it's about how this culture of censorship is reshaping the very fabric of society. Take the case of Sarah White, her crime, hanging a flag. A simple, patriotic gesture meant to show her pride was deemed a threat by the authorities. Within moments of placing the flag outside a public building, Sarah was surrounded by armed police officers, hauled away in full view of stunned onlookers. The footage of the arrest made its rounds online, but mainstream outlets barely covered it. Why? Because it didn't fit the narrative. It wasn't about actual threats or violence. It was about a symbol, one that contradicted the increasingly dominant ideology of the moment. What's truly chilling is the silence that followed. People who should be standing up for these basic freedoms, elected officials, journalists, public figures, have instead remained largely mute. Even when things like Sarah's arrest make headlines, there's no real outrage, no calls for justice, just a collective turning of the blind eye. This isn't just about one person being arrested, it's about a wider shift in what's considered acceptable in public discourse. The more this suppression continues, the more citizens begin to live in fear. Fear of speaking out, fear of being labeled, fear of being arrested simply for expressing an opinion. The fact that figures like Graham Lahan, once a leading voice in British comedy, now feel forced to leave the country for fear of criminalization speaks volumes. Lahan didn't just leave the UK for new opportunities. He left to escape a country where speaking freely no longer felt safe. As these events unfold, the fear is spreading. And it's not just confined to the UK anymore. American voices, concerned about the rapid decline of free speech across the pond, are beginning to ask, what happens when this reaches us? The consequences of silencing speech and stifling dissent aren't just theoretical anymore, they're becoming real, tangible fears that affect everyday citizens, and the world is watching closely, wondering how much longer this can go on before it spreads beyond the borders of the UK. As the situation in the UK worsens, the government's response has been nothing short of a denial of reality. Despite mounting evidence of the erosion of free speech, government officials continue to insist that everything is fine, that the UK remains a bastion of free expression. Karma, the government's poster boy for the everything's fine narrative, has been particularly vocal, standing in front of the cameras and repeating the mantra, "We've had free speech for a very, very long time." It's a line that, by now, has become almost laughable. But the reality on the ground tells a different story. While Karma and others in positions of power continue to parrot these hollow assurances, whispers from the back channels tell a far darker tale. Behind closed doors, there's growing concern about the increasing control over speech and the manipulation of public narratives to fit a particular ideological agenda. Yet, when faced with direct questions about censorship, whether in the Oval Office or at Trump Turnberry, the government refuses to acknowledge the problem. The contradiction is glaring. In public, officials claim that free speech is alive and well, but in private, there's a growing acknowledgement that this claim is far from true. The mounting evidence of arrests over seemingly innocuous opinions, the clampdown on independent journalism, and the way dissent is increasingly treated as a crime can no longer be ignored. Yet, the government continues to bury its head in the sand, refusing to engage with the reality of the situation. This denial is not just a political strategy, it's a dangerous game. By refusing to acknowledge the problem, the government is essentially paving the way for further authoritarian control. And while they deny the existence of a free speech crisis, the very people who should be standing up for this fundamental right are finding themselves silenced, marginalized, or even criminalized. The UK's government isn't just ignoring the issue, it's actively contributing to it, making it clear that the preservation of free speech is no longer a priority. The truth is being buried, and the people who once fought for it are now the ones being forced to leave. The UK's free speech crisis isn't just a political issue or a temporary phase, it's a wake-up call to the world. Figures like Graham Lahan and Sarah White, who once felt free to express their opinions without fear of retribution, are now fleeing a country where speaking out has become a criminal act. Their stories aren't isolated. They're part of a broader trend that threatens to redefine what it means to be free in the modern world. The fact that voices like Ben Shapiro and Donald Trump have picked up the torch for free speech in the UK is telling. It's not just about celebrities or former royals anymore. The battle for free expression is global. What's happening in the UK is a glimpse of a future where censorship becomes the norm and dissent is silenced. If we're not careful, the same forces that are tightening their grip on speech in Britain could extend beyond its borders, impacting countries like the US and others that pride themselves on their commitment to free expression. The irony of it all, the UK, a country once proud of its tradition of free speech, is now becoming a cautionary tale. As public figures and ordinary citizens alike continue to be punished for their words, we're left with an important question. What happens when a nation that once celebrated bold opinions and satire no longer does? Will it become the new norm for countries around the world to criminalize free thought? It's time to ask ourselves, are we willing to let this happen? Because if we don't speak up now, the future may look very different and not for the better. The crisis in the UK serves as a stark reminder. Free speech is fragile, and once it starts to crumble, it's a long, hard road back. The question is, who will stand up to defend it before it's too late?